Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to look at a story from Genesis, chapter 20.
Mm.
It's about Abraham and Sarah,
Yeah.
and their journey to a place called Gerar. And it's ruled by King Abimelech.
Mm.
Now, those of you who are familiar with Genesis,
Yeah.
you know that this isn't the first time that Abraham's kind of pulled a trick to protect himself.
Yeah.
But this time, it feels like the stakes are higher and the consequences are a little more complex.
Yeah, it really gets into some of the deeper parts of human nature and,
Yeah.
what do we do when we're afraid and how do we react, under
Okay.
pressure?
So to kind of set the scene, Abraham and Sarah, they arrive in Gerar, and Abraham, fearing for his safety, basically tells Abimelech that Sarah is his sister, not his wife.
Right.
Now, this sounds familiar, right? He did the same thing way back in Genesis chapter 12.
Yeah.
So it's like, what would drive a man of faith like Abraham to repeat this? I mean, what is he thinking?
Well, I mean, it makes you wonder if there's is it just a survival tactic or is there something else going on? Maybe like some insecurity or even a lack of trust in God's protection.
That's a great point. I mean, after years of, seeing God come through for him, you'd think that he'd have like a deeper sense of security. But, I guess even the most faithful of us, we can struggle with fear,
Right.
especially when we're in a new place and there are all these unknowns.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows you that no matter who you are, we all have these basic human emotions. And even if you're, super devout, you can still wrestle with, pretty human fears.
For sure. So Abimelech,
Oh.
he believes the story, takes Sarah into his household. And this is where it gets really interesting because, like, without anybody knowing,
Mm-hmm.
God kind of steps in.
Yeah.
God appears to Abimelech in a dream and reveals that Sarah is actually Abraham's wife, not his sister,
Right.
and warns him that taking her would be like a huge sin. It's really like a turning point in the story.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's all about this divine intervention,
Yeah.
and that God's, watching over things.
Oh, definitely. You could almost feel the tension, right? You have Abimelech, and he's totally innocent. He has no idea.
Yeah.
But he's about to make a really serious mistake.
Yeah.
And God steps in to kind of stop a disaster from happening.
Well, it also tells us that God's really involved in what happens in the world, even in these kind of messy situations.
Yeah.
He's working to fulfill his promises and to keep those who are important to his plan safe.
Exactly. It's not even just about protecting Sarah physically. It's about protecting this lineage that God promised to Abraham and Sarah. The line that would eventually lead to Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's huge. It adds this whole other level to the story, right? Because
Right.
it shows God's commitment to his covenants and how his actions have these long-term consequences.
Right. Okay, so Abimelech, he hasn't even touched Sarah, but he wakes up from this dream, and he is freaked out, and he immediately goes to Abraham and confronts him about this whole lie. And this is where we see another interesting thing happen.
I mean, the way Abimelech reacts is really something. Like, instead of just getting angry or wanting revenge, he stays calm and he wants to understand.
Yeah, he really could have lost it, but he doesn't. He just calmly confronts Abraham, wants to know why he lied to him like that.
Well, it really says a lot about his character. He doesn't just lash out, He wants to figure things out, find a resolution. Makes you think about how we deal with conflict, right? Do we fly off the handle or do we try to be a little more understanding?
It is a good reminder that we always have a choice in how we react when things get tough. So Abraham, caught in his lie, he tries to explain himself. He says he was scared for his life.
Right.
He says that in his culture, it was like a lesser evil to say Sarah was his sister than to risk being killed if people knew she was his wife.
Well, that's interesting. It gives you a glimpse into how things were back then and how it maybe affected Abraham's choices. I mean, sometimes it's hard to know what's right or wrong, especially when culture comes into play.
For sure. But even though he tries to justify it, the consequences of his lie are already like spreading.
Yeah.
And it's not just affecting him, it's affecting Abimelech and his whole household.
Exactly. Because of what Abraham did, God had closed the wombs of all the women in Abimelech's house. It's like a stark reminder that what we do, even if it's out of fear, can have consequences we never intended. And they can affect others in ways we might not even see coming.
Yeah. It's like what goes around comes around. Even if you don't mean any harm, our choices impact others in good ways and bad.
Exactly. It just highlights how important it is to really think about what might happen because of the things we do, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us.
So how do things get sorted out? Because the tension is like super high.
Right. Well, Abimelech shows that he's a man of integrity. He does what's right. He gives Sarah back to Abraham. He gives him livestock, servants, even land. Like, he's making up for what happened, even though he was the one who was tricked.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible. He goes so far to fix things.
It says so much about him, right? He takes responsibility, even though he was deceived. It's really a powerful example of taking ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. But the story doesn't end there. There's something else that shows the power of forgiveness, and reconciliation.
You're right. So Abimelech, understanding how serious things are, he asks Abraham to pray for him and his household. He knows that the infertility, that the women's wombs being closed, it's all because of the lie. And he asks for Abraham to pray for God's help.
It's a powerful moment.
Huh.
He's basically saying, look, I've done what I can to make things right, but I need your help. It's a big deal to admit you need help, especially from someone who hurt you.
It speaks to how powerful forgiveness is. Abimelech could have stayed angry, but but he chooses grace. He wants to heal the relationship.
And the amazing thing is that Abraham, even though he messed up, he prays for Abimelech. And you know what? God answers the prayers, fertility is restored, and things are healed.
It's really a testament to how powerful prayer can be, and how forgiveness and compassion, they can really change things. They show us that even when things are broken, there's always hope for healing.
Wow. So much happened. We see how people act. We see choices they make. And then forgiveness and how God acts. It's an old story, but it makes you think about life today. How can we learn from this? What can we take from this and apply to our own lives? Well, let's talk about that next. Okay, so we've been talking about this whole thing with Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelech. We saw the deception, the fear, the accountability, and in the end, the forgiveness and how God brought healing. It's an old story, but it really gets you thinking, doesn't it, about human nature and about the choices we make when things get tough.
It really does. I mean, it's a story that people can relate to even today. It's all about like those universal experiences like fear, insecurity, wanting to protect yourself, and then dealing with the fallout of your actions, whether you meant for them to happen or not.
So let's kind of shift gears here
Mhm.
and talk about how this story can speak to us, in the present. Like, what are some things we can learn from it? What can we apply to our lives today?
Well, one of the big things that stands out is like the importance of being honest. Abraham's choice to lie, even though he was scared, it created this whole mess, right? And it didn't just affect him, it affected innocent people too.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that being dishonest, even when we think we have a good reason, can really damage trust. It can hurt relationships. It can cause unnecessary pain.
That's like they say, the truth will set you free,
Yeah.
right? But sometimes telling the truth is really hard, especially when we're scared of what might happen. So how do we get the courage to be honest even when it's difficult?
I think it starts with realizing that even though it might be uncomfortable at first, being honest actually leads to more peace of mind. And it builds stronger relationships. It's about building trust, both with ourselves and with others.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like when you try to hide a little mistake with a lie,
Mm-hmm.
and then that lie just keeps growing, it's better to just be honest right away, even if it's hard.
Exactly. Sometimes that means having those tough conversations, admitting when we mess up, and being willing to apologize and make things right. Which brings us to another important part of this story, taking responsibility.
Yeah. Abimelech, even though he was lied to, he steps up and tries to fix things.
Uh-huh.
He gives Sarah back to Abraham, he offers him gifts, and he even asks for Abraham's prayers to, heal his household.
It's a powerful example of like what it means to be accountable. It's not about never messing up. It's about owning up to our mistakes, saying sorry when we need to, and trying to fix any harm we've caused.
It's definitely something we can all learn from. It's so easy to blame others, but it's when we take responsibility for our part that we really grow.
Absolutely. And it might not always be easy, but it's so important for having good relationships and for making the world a better place.
And we can't forget about forgiveness, right? Like Abimelech, he could have held a grudge, but he chose to forgive Abraham. And then Abraham prayed for him and his whole household was healed.
That's so true. It's like a perfect example of how forgiveness can break down walls between people. It opens our hearts. It makes real change possible. It reminds us that holding on to anger only hurts us. But when we forgive, it sets us free.
It's like they say, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It doesn't mean what happened was okay, but it lets you move on without all that negativity.
Exactly. And I know it's not always easy, especially when you've been hurt, but it's something we can practice. Letting go of the past and making room for healing and new beginnings.
Wow, this deep dive has been amazing. We talked about honesty, taking responsibility, and forgiveness. And it's not just some theory, right? It's a real story with real people who made mistakes. And in the end, found redemption.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that we all mess up sometimes, but we can always learn and grow. There's always a chance to make things better.
And that's a message we all need to hear. So as you go through your week, think about honesty, responsibility, and forgiveness. Where do they show up in your life? What choices can you make that line up with these ideas? And how can you show yourself and those around you more grace and compassion? That's all for today's deep dive.